It's my honor to introduce Dane Pellebon. Ms. Pellebon is a community activist who has been working against oppression in all forms throughout her adult life. She is the executive director of RCC Sexual Violence Resource Center in Dane County and also coordinates community partnerships for countywide sexual assault victim services through the Sexual Assault Response Team, the Commission on Sensitive Crimes, and the Domestic Violence and Sexual Violence Coordinated Community Response Team. She is currently on the board of directors for Outreach LGBTQ+ Center, Urban Triage, Freedom Inc., and World Builders. She has extensive experience working with persons experiencing homelessness through her work as the former director of housing and operations at Porchlight. Her activism extends to all aspects of her life, including art. She's a theater professional, a co-founder of the Loud and Unchained Black Theater Festival, and the principal of the Madison Theater Collective. She is part of the team that is bringing the Center for Black Excellence and Culture to life. She is also an elected official serving as the Dane County Supervisor for District 33. Please join me in a warm welcome for Ms. Dane Pellebon.
So I'm also very tired. I don't know if you heard all those things. That's a thing. So good morning. My name is Dane Pellebon. This is so loud. Does it have to be this loud? Is that better? Ooh, no, not better at all. Hello? Yeah, that's better. Good morning. My name is Dane Pellebon. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. I'm the executive director of RCC Sexual Violence Resource Center, formerly known as the Rape Crisis Center. Thank you so much for joining me today. Just do it like that. So before we get started, I am going to give a content warning. As you know, we're going to be talking about some things that could activate your body and activate your emotions. We no longer use the word triggered. The reason why that is that we've actually gotten quite a bit of feedback from persons who have dealt with gun violence that word within itself can be activating. So if you hear me use the word activating, please know that we are working to change the culture in many different ways, including how it is that we utilize our language. So today, if you are feeling activated by the content that you are hearing, and that means you are experiencing some fear or sadness, panic, increased heart rate, being unable to focus, flashbacks, sweaty and clammy, there we go. Whoop, is that better? Hello? Okay. Stomach discomfort, please know that you can leave the room and take care of yourself. To me, it is imperative that as you are listening and you are listening to your body, that you are making good decisions for yourself. Another thing to note is that sometimes these type of presentations may not bring feelings of activation right now, but later on in the day, they might. So I want to let you know that we do have 2 24-hour helplines that are available that can provide emotional support. We have a helpline in English language and we have a helpline in Spanish language. So today for our objectives, we are going to define sexual assault, explain mandated reporting versus protective interrupting, and discuss victim rights and the advocate's role, examine the importance of forensic nurse exams, and then summarize some considerations for historically excluded populations. Before we begin, I'm going to give you a couple of notes. I will use the terms victim and survivor interchangeably. How it is that I use those words professionally is I utilize the term victim while they're going through system processes, whether that be working through law enforcement, whether they be working through the criminal justice system. And then once they are past that system, we then refer to our clients as survivors. I will also, for the purposes of this presentation, utilize the pronouns she for victim and he for perpetrator. However, I do want you to know that anyone can be a perpetrator and that gender is non-binary. But for the purposes of this presentation today, I'm going to make it easy on myself and use those two pronouns. And again, please take care of yourself and others. So if you are next to a friend and that friend is not doing well, please encourage them to take care of themselves also. So what is sexual violence? Sexual violence is any behavior that happens without a person's consent. We utilize sexual violence as an umbrella term, but that term covers a lot of different behaviors and actions. So we typically think of sexual violence, we think of sexual assault or rape, sexual abuse, sexual exploitation. There's also sexual harassment, stalking, indecent exposure, degrading sexual imagery, voyeurism, cyber harassment, and human trafficking. One of the things that we're actually seeing quite a bit of lately is sexual exploitation via cyber harassment, where persons are being manipulated to give pictures of themselves, and then from there, they are being coerced to give money and or other things in order to not have those pictures brought out. So that is one of the things that you actually may be seeing moving forward, and especially with our teens. This is something that's rather prominent these days. Sexual assault itself is any unwanted and or non-consensual contact. What do we mean by sexual contact? Anyone? You didn't know you were going to have to participate today, did you? What do you mean by sexual contact? So we know the basics, right? But what about you're in the gym and you're hanging out with someone and they come around and they slap you on the behind? Is that sexual contact? It is. That is typical locker room behavior. However, we do want to let people know that any unwanted and non-consensual sexual contact is sexual assault. That is the definition of sexual assault. So things that are typically within our culture that are norms per se, unfortunately do meet the definition of sexual assault. So as you are, again, talking to patients and talking to persons around you, and they are relaying experiences to you that are unwanted and non-consensual sexual contact, please note, sometimes persons don't understand that that is what is happening to them. One of the most striking statistics that we have come across is that 18% of college students whose incident fits the legal definition of rape do not actually consider that situation rape. So there is not a lot of information in the general public and or with youth in particular about what is sexual assault and what is sexual violence. So why do we do this work? Nationally, you will see that 43% of women and 25% of men experience some sort of sexual violence within their lifetime. That rate is almost double for trans persons. The vast majority of survivors experience sexual violence before they turn the age of 24. When we look at sexual harassment, 77% of women and 34% of men report verbal sexual harassment. 62% of women and 26% of men report physically aggressive forms of sexual harassment, and 41% of women and 22% of men report cyber sexual harassment. And this is over the course of a lifetime. So this is pretty significant when we are looking at the totality of sexual violence and sexual harassment in our day-to-day lives. So let's talk about mandated reporters. Most of you in this room will most likely be mandated reporters. So a mandated reporter is required by law to report child abuse and or neglect to county or law enforcement. This also covers persons who are over a particular age, usually 62, who may be also vulnerable. In addition, mandated reporters are required to report threats of school violence to law enforcement. Now, understand that mandated reporters are defined by state laws. In Wisconsin, all medical and mental health professionals are mandated reporters. Victim advocates who work with victims of sexual violence are not necessarily mandated reporters. And that's going to be important coming up later, especially when we're dealing with children. Unless they are licensed clinical social workers or mental health professionals, they generally are not mandated reporters. There are some exceptions for healthcare professionals giving reproductive care, treatment for sexually transmitted diseases, and OBGYN care so that children can receive access to privacy in healthcare. However, I do want you to check your local statutes. If you're living in Wisconsin and working in Wisconsin, we use statute 48.981. So when you are talking to someone and they are about to disclose a sexual assault, there are things that we like to tell people who are mandated reporters. The first is inform that patient that you are a mandated reporter, because that means something. A lot of times people think when they are working with professionals that this is a confidential space and that anything that they say won't go beyond the space between you and them. Well, with mandated reporting, that's not necessarily the case. So you should let folks know that you are a mandated reporter and how that then will affect them moving forward. Want to make sure that you know that those reports go to law enforcement and any county agencies, for example, CPS. And where the incident occurs matters. One of the things that we see a lot is someone will come in and they will say, this is something that happened to me. I would like to contact law enforcement. And then we call law enforcement and then they say, oh, well, this happened in Columbia County. Well, that means Madison and Dane County law enforcement actually does not respond to that call. We have to call Columbia County law enforcement in order to make that report happen. So as you are talking to people, the location of the incident does actually matter because that depends on who it is that you're making the phone call to. And the reason why I say that is that, again, coming forward is hard. It is a sensitive situation. And from there, you have a whole bunch of activity coming to you and it's Madison police and they're sitting there and they say, ma'am, where did this happen? And that person says, Columbia County. And they go, oh, I'm sorry. We are not the right people. So then there's a whole other process that has to happen. Meanwhile, that person has girded themselves in order to work with that one law enforcement agency, and you could lose that victim cooperating just because it's hard, right? So make sure that you are contacting the right individuals if you do need to contact law enforcement. Now let's talk about protective interrupting. So protective interrupting is a strategy to prevent a child or person in need of protection from disclosing until they are in a private space. So what that looks like, and I'm going to go right over to language on the tips, is, oh, this sounds really important. Can we go into another room to talk where it's more private? Especially if you are dealing in a situation at a school and a child comes up to you. Let's say you are there doing some type of nursing or something where you are there for any medical reason. And there is a child that comes up to you and they're in a large group of children and they're saying, oh my gosh, you're a doctor. I need to talk to you about, you can stop them and bring them to a private space. That is an okay thing. We actually encourage you to do so because there are a lot of considerations that have to go into what happens next. So the options when you are working with someone that you've had to protective interrupt is first, you go through what the steps are in a disclosure if you are a mandated reporter. So that looks like saying, I need you to know first, anything that you say to me, if you are being harmed or exploited or neglected, I need you to know that I will have to contact law enforcement, and I may have to call CPS, and I may need to inform your parents. So let them know what is going to happen next. One of the things that is very traumatic for children that are going through sexual violence is, again, thinking that they're coming to a confidential space, and then the next thing they know, there are consequences to that they aren't expecting. It can be very unsettling for a youth to finally get the courage to come forward to a trusted adult. And then the next thing they know, they have CPS and they have law enforcement sitting with them, and they weren't expecting that. The other thing you can do is you can contact a victim advocacy program like RCC to talk with the patient about the next steps. So if you feel uncomfortable going through, okay, what's going to happen next? There's a reason why RCC has a 24-hour helpline. We routinely take phone calls from people who are saying, I have someone here that would like to disclose. I don't know what to do next. Who can I talk to? Our advocates can work through any situation with you, with loved ones, and with the victim to go through what was happening next. Don't guarantee safety. That's pretty important. I actually stopped using the term safe spaces because I can't guarantee that any space is going to be safe. I can say that I am going to provide for you a space where you have the freedom to talk to me confidentially as an advocate. I'm going to provide you a space where I will do what I can to make sure that your rights are protected, but I cannot offer you a safe space, nor can I offer you safety. So a lot of times, out of the goodness of people's hearts, people say things like, you know what, we're going to contact the police, we're going to keep you safe. Please don't guarantee that, because you cannot keep that victim safe. And then again, explain who you must call and why. So again, as a mandated reporter, you do need to let people know what is next and why you are doing that. Because again, with youth in particular, they may not understand why you need to do those things. So just let them know there is a law that says it is my job to offer you a protective space in order to make sure that you're being well cared for moving forward. So let's talk about victims' rights here in Wisconsin. So recently, there was an amendment to our Constitution called Marsy's Law. So Marsy's Law ensures victims of rights have enforceable rights through the criminal justice system. And it also strengthens current laws on the books, for example, the right to privacy. And that right is still somewhat limited. So, for example, you do have the right to privacy regarding talking to advocates, but you may not have the right to privacy if you are a youth that is talking to a medical professional. You may not have the right to privacy during a trial if it has been deemed that, for example, your mental health records are open and available for the defense. However, we are still working through the codifications of Marsy's Law to strengthen the rights as much as possible. In addition, here in Wisconsin, there is a right to victim advocacy accompaniment. So victims have the right to have an advocate during forensic nurse exams and law enforcement interviews and any court interactions that victim may have. We're going to get to what a advocate is. However, one thing that you should know is that a lot of victim advocacy organizations provide 24-hour coverage for forensic nurse exams and law enforcement interviews. So if you are in a situation where you're in an ER and there's someone that comes in and you have a forensic nurse examination program like there is over at Meriter Hospital, an advocate is routinely called for everyone that comes in. Now, if you are at an office, this is something that had happened a year ago, and this victim would like to have law enforcement come to the office to give a report, you can call a victim advocate to come to that office to be with that victim. So it's important to know that advocates are there to work with the clients to make sure very important things. And let's talk about what those things are. What is a victim advocate? A victim advocate, and this is the legal definition, is an individual who is an employee of or a volunteer for an organization, the purpose of which is to provide counseling, assistance, or support services free of charge to a victim. So any sexual assault advocacy program, those services in Wisconsin are free. They do not have to pay for them. So when people say, oh, I don't know if I really want a victim advocate, I don't know if I can afford having someone else come in and deal with my case, please know that those services are available to victims in Wisconsin for free. So our role, the first is we support victims during hospital, law enforcement, and court interactions. And that can look a variety of different ways. It could be, I'm just sitting there, I am someone that you can talk to, that you can have my hand, you can cry with. I am someone that will help you fill out the crime victim compensation application, explain to you what is happening next. I can obtain information. So for example, once someone has reported to law enforcement, a lot of times connecting with law enforcement after then can be activating, or connecting with court officials can be activating. So we can obtain that information and relay that to the victim. We do resource finding and explaining system processes and ensuring that the victim is treated with trauma responsive care. So there's a difference between trauma informed. I can be informed about trauma versus trauma responsive, and that is how I respond to that trauma. So we look to making sure that that victim is treated with trauma responsive care. We also ensure that victims' rights are being respected. So for example, when there is law enforcement that is there and they decide that they actually don't want to disclose and they don't want to move forward, and law enforcement says, but you know, we want to get this person off the street, could you please work through those things? We actually stop law enforcement from pushing that issue. We really want to make sure that their right to participate or not participate is respected, that the victim's wishes are being heard and followed. And this is really important when we're dealing with youth. So when you are in a situation where there's youth and there are a bunch of adults, a lot of times the youth will say yes to literally almost anything, even though they're not very comfortable saying yes. I actually make sure that anytime I'm working with anyone under the age of 18, that I actually take a second to sit with them by myself and say, okay, let's talk about what it is that you want. So that when I come back into that room with all of the adults, I can say, this is what this person wants. This is how this person would like to move forward, so that they know that they have someone who is empowered to speak on their behalf if there are things that they feel uncomfortable with participating in. We also provide emotional support and case management services. Oftentimes, I find that the most pressing need for a victim of sexual assault isn't actually anything having to do with the assault. A lot of times it has to do with housing security, what happens next, safety concerns, food insecurity, how it is that I'm going to talk to my professors, how it is I'm going to talk to my medical professionals, how it is I'm going to talk to my job. So we make sure that not just their physical needs and their needs with the criminal justice system are taken care of, but we try to work on a holistic view. What is it that you need in order to help move through this situation? So we do quite a few things along the lines of, we also work with the CCS program. where we do intensive case management for those with aorta and mental health diagnoses. And again, making sure that we have the resources to provide wraparound services around food insecurity, housing insecurity, and then advocate for situations like transitional housing and other things that are needed in the system in order to help that victim. So typically, when a person comes to a medical professional's office, they don't know that there are programs that deal specifically for sexual violence. So you will have someone that may come to you at an office and disclose, right? The next step in that disclosure, especially if that is an incident that has taken place rather recently, is forensic nurses and a forensic nurse exam. So a forensic nurse is a nurse that's undergone specialized training to provide holistic care of victims of sensitive crimes like sexual assault and domestic violence to obtain evidence for prosecution. They can also collect physical evidence from suspected perpetrators. Forensic nurses are trained to testify in criminal proceedings based on the results of the exam, and that's pretty important. Many times medical professionals are like, okay, this person came in, let me check and see how their body is doing. And then I'm gonna send them to an RCC because I don't really know what's happening next. If they're in your office, you can get them to that forensic nurse exam right away. Let them know that this is a service that is available to them that is also free. The forensic nurse exam is free. Now, sometimes there are medical needs outside of the forensic nurse exam that may not be, and victim advocate centers like RCC does work with them to make sure that those bills are taken care of, but that forensic nurse exam is free, and let's talk about that exam. So forensic nurse exams document a series of events from the victim. So they get the narrative of the story. And that's important to know. And one of the reasons why I bring it up only with the forensic nurse exam is that I don't want you asking questions to that victim about their story. We know that multiple times having to tell your story can be traumatic. And you actually, as a medical professional, don't need to know the details of that story. However, you do need to let them know that there is the option that they can go to a forensic nurse exam. And as a part of that forensic nurse exam, they do get that narrative. And a lot of times, if law enforcement is going to be included, law enforcement is there for that narrative so that, again, we can minimize the amount of times that that person is telling a story. And for children, there is something actually called child advocacy centers, where there are forensic interviewers that work specifically with children to get that story. And law enforcement actually is not a part of that. Law enforcement watches that interview, but they don't do a lot of the direct questioning. Because again, when we are looking at trauma responsive care, we know that children having to tell that story again and again to people that they are trying to please, like law enforcement, that can change how the story goes. So there are special forensic interviewers for children. Other things that they do at a forensic nurse exam is that they obtain a medical history. They document injuries on a body map, and I don't know where my pretty picture of the body map went, but it's gone. I'm sorry, you guys. So as they go through and they're talking to you, they will say to the victim, okay, did they touch you anywhere on this part of your body? And the victim says, well, they touched me here, they touched me here, they may have had their hands around here. So they know when they're going through the body, they will map on the body all the places that they touched so that they can do the next things, which is take photos of injuries and collect swabs for DNA analysis. One of the things that you should know in Wisconsin, There's been a lot of conversations about rape kits and the backlog in rape kits. Well, Wisconsin has worked really, really hard to get through the backlog here. And in addition, there are laws in the books that say if you come to a forensic nurse exam and you get evidence collected and you are not sure that you want to move forward with prosecution, you actually have 10 years to make that decision. So they bring that kit to the crime lab and then it sits in storage for 10 years. And at that point, and it's actually 9 years, 6 months, you can still say, hey, I actually do want to move forward on this case. And they will bring your kit and then process it moving forward. The other thing that's really cool here in Wisconsin is that we actually have a kit tracking system so that you know where your information is at all times. So let's say you do move forward with prosecution and you want to know, is my kit at the crime lab? Did it come back to law enforcement? Because I do need you to know law enforcement is not going to call with every single step that comes through. So instead, they have given a code to victims here in Wisconsin where they can log into a website and at any point in time know where their kit is and what is happening with it. They also do holistic care, including reproductive options, and then they also offer referrals. So when you have someone in your office and they disclose, two things that you can offer them right away. First is an advocate. That's important. One of the things that we find is people that work with advocates actually tend to work with the criminal justice system in an easier manner. They tend to cooperate more with criminal justice, which as far as we're concerned, that is a nice byproduct, but we actually don't have any feelings whatsoever either way, whether or not someone wants to work with law enforcement or not, because we do know that going through the criminal justice system is also traumatic. So we make sure that people have their options either way. But then again, if they do, the forensic nurse exam is an important next step, because that is where the physical evidence is obtained and the story is narrated in a place that is a little more friendly for the victim. So let's talk about a couple of things about victims themselves. When victims come in, and this is why it's important to think about what it is you say and why it is that you're saying these things. There are a couple of false underlying assumptions that we see a lot with victims. The first is that they could have done something to prevent that crime from occurring. If only I hadn't have, if only I didn't, if only I had said. Not if only that person hadn't perpetrated. So when you're talking to someone and you say words like, well, why would you do that? Why did you go with that person? Now, you might be asking that question to be like, oh, I just want to know the series of events. Why did you go to this next place? So they know kind of what's happening next. For victims, they may take that in a very different manner. They may go, you're right. Why did I go there? Why did I do this thing? Oh man, if only I hadn't done this thing, then this would not have happened to me. The second is that they then deserve that experience because of their behaviors, their actions, or their decisions. I deserve what happened to me because I put myself in a dangerous situation by going to a bar, by having 2 more drinks than what I normally have, and I was wearing a short skirt. These are things that are still said by victims. Even though we like to think that what it is that we are doing as a culture is normalizing the fact that victims are not at fault, that's not necessarily what is happening for victims in their heads. So one of the things that we know is that all oppression is connected. Sexual violence is a tool of power and control, and the rates of sexual violence over the course of a lifetime go up based on being marginalized, or what I like to call historically excluded. So for Black women, the rates for sexual violence over their lifetime is 60%. For mixed race men, 31%. Now, if you remember, it was 43% and 23% for all persons. For Indigenous women, that is 61%. For Latino women, it is about 50%. For persons with developmental disabilities, 90%. They are some of our most vulnerable. And that is born in the fact that you see that 90% of them experience some sort of sexual violence over the course of their lifetime. And for trans persons, that is 47%. So let's talk about some of these intersections. We know that how people experience things based on their identities is very different. And we do know that there are some things that may prevent persons from moving forward with a disclosure. So for Black women, for every Black woman who reports a rape, there are at least 15 Black women who do not report. That is staggering. That is staggering. There are cultural considerations that can hinder healing for Black women survivors. First, there is the burdensome expectation of strong Black womanhood. I cannot tell you how many times that I have been in crisis myself, or I have been overwhelmed, and someone goes, "But you're a strong Black woman." And I was like, well, maybe I'm a tired Black woman, y'all. I don't have to be strong all the time. But because this is the trope that is placed upon Black women, a lot of times we feel that we cannot reach out for the help that we need to reach out for because we are being strong. And you'll see that in with some of your patients. There is the power of the Black church. There is the desire to shield Black men. One of the things that we know is that perpetration tends to happen between races. And I know that Black men are disproportionately jailed, disproportionately arrested, and disproportionately sentenced in the criminal justice system. So I may feel the burden as a Black woman to not put another Black man in jail. And these are words that have actually come from victims. That's not what it is that I want to do. So I have zero opinion about that, but I do need you to know that this may be one of the things that will prevent them from speaking about their experience. And there are a lack of self-care examples that are all real dynamics for Black women survivors. Now, because of our unique history of racist and sexist victimization, the Black community has a harder time than others dealing with rape. For Latina women, Latina and Hispanic survivors do also face complex barriers. In addition to the barriers that we talked about, there is shame and fear of not being believed. And that is something that Latin survivors have said very specifically to advocates. This is in my culture. I don't want to feel shame. I don't want to have to go into this space knowing that this has happened to me. I won't be supported. They may experience language barriers. There is a reason why most of our services are bilingual, and by most of, I think, the only reason that there's a couple that aren't, we make sure that there are interpreters available every step of the way. But if you are someone, and this is not your first language, you may not know the words to move forward. And I'll use a situation that happened with 911. 911 did not have Latina or Latino persons on the dispatch. Someone called in, it wasn't their first language. They were trying to explain that someone was in their house and that they were being sexually assaulted. What the person heard was that someone was just trying to be in the house. So when law enforcement came in, how they interacted with that survivor was very different versus they knew that there was someone that was in that house that had sexually assaulted them. Versus they just thought somebody had just come to the door, had tried to get into the door, because the person didn't understand what was happening on dispatch. So it took literally about 3 hours for law enforcement to understand what was actually happening in that space. So it's important that we are looking at how we experience language when we are dealing with survivors. There is also fear of deportation of themselves and or of loved ones. I can't tell you how many youth who have come to us, because again, we are not mandated reporters. We do not actually have to go to law enforcement and say very clearly, this has happened to me, but I don't want to go forward because this person is not documented. And they don't want to be responsible for them being sent to a place that they believe is more dangerous than what could happen to them here. So instead, they keep that to themselves and they don't report. And then again, discrimination and cultural stigma. For trans persons, members of the LGBT communities in the US face higher rates of sexual violence than the general population. This sexual violence is perpetrated because, so we had talked about that most perpetrations happen within race. For LGBTQ survivors, that perpetration tends to happen regardless of sexual preference. So this also comes in the form of hate crimes, where the crimes are specifically tied to that person's identity, and also can happen by persons that are also LGBTQ. They may be reluctant to disclose sexual orientation or gender identity to service providers because that disclosure could prevent services from happening. So there are wonderful faith communities that do a lot of really good work with survivors. They may not want to work with a trans survivor, and that's a problem. And so persons may not come forward about their identity. What we also see with kids is if I am being true to myself and my parents don't know because I am afraid of my parents' reaction, and I say, this is what happened to me, this is the space that it happened to me in, and you are a mandated reporter and you've got to go and talk to that parent to say, this is what happened and this is how, and your child's pronouns are she and her, and that parent knows that child as he and him, that can be a problem. We know that rates of LGBTQ youth homelessness are skyrocketing. And unfortunately, that is because of barriers that happen in the home. Also, when you are talking to people, I always ask their pronouns. I share my pronouns first, and I ask if they would mind sharing their pronouns. And if they do, great. And if they don't, that's okay. And then the second question I ask is, are you okay with me utilizing this pronoun outside of the space between me and you? Because again, we don't know how they have identified outside of this confidential space. And then when I'm talking to youth, I really try to make sure, can I use this pronoun with your parents? So for persons with disabilities, someone who needs regular assistance may rely on a person who is abusing them for care. And this has become exacerbated over the COVID-19 pandemic. We know that there are less and less personal care workers that are in the field. So if I am a person that relies on a personal care worker, and I have been told, and please understand, this is something that happens rather often, that this is the only person that can provide care to you, and that person is sexually assaulting that person every time that they're there, they may not disclose because their options are endure this, or I don't get fed. I don't get cared for. I don't get bathed. So there are choices that persons with disabilities have to make. An abuser can take away access to tools from a person with disability that they use to communicate, so they can control their phone, they can control their email, they can control any access to the outside world. So when we think about that statistic of 90% of persons with developmental disabilities experience some sort of sexual violence over a lifetime, that is because that power and control dynamic, there is someone that almost exclusively has power over a variety of aspects of their day-to-day lives. Persons with disabilities are maybe less likely to be taken seriously when they make a report of sexual abuse or assault. They maybe say, some of the things I've typically seen said are, oh, you know, this person tells a lot of falsehoods. Or, that couldn't have happened. I know so-and-so, he's a great caregiver. So they don't give persons with developmental disabilities in particular agency over what has happened to them, or even their story about what has happened to them. Instead, it is minimized because they have a developmental disability. Please don't do that. They also may not understand or lack information about healthy sexuality and types of touching that are appropriate or inappropriate. So I have a son with autism. I will tell you, the first few years of his life, you know what I wasn't concerned about? I wasn't concerned about explaining every single thing because we were concerned about making it through the day, right? So I had to go back and have conversations that were different that I would have had with him younger, because I had to really encapsulate those conversations differently. And a lot of parents don't know how to do that, or may be overwhelmed by their situation and may not be thinking, I also need to explain to them these things, these 4 things here, instead of, I've got to make sure that this child eats because they are unable to eat on their own. So there are a lot of kids with disabilities that do not know the information about healthy sexuality. And this can be especially challenging if that person's disability requires touch. So making sure that when you are talking with someone about, we typically say good touch, bad touch, where we talk about what is an appropriate touch and what is inappropriate. So consider how, oh, let me turn that thing off. There we go. Consider how you may show up for survivors that you work with. So obviously we all have intersections of our identity. What part of your intersections or experience may impact how they receive you? So when I talk to law enforcement, yesterday when I was talking to the sheriffs, I said, so what is it about you, just for you being there, that could be, that could affect how they experience you? And they're like, well, I'm carrying a gun. Absolutely, that makes a difference. Makes a difference if you're in a uniform. It makes a difference if when you walk into that room, you are like, hello. Yes, what did you say? What was wrong with you? That's not very warm and opening. As a Black woman, I have experienced an enormous amount of medical trauma because doctors don't listen to me. So it's important that as you are working through with people, that you make sure that you are connecting with that person and their experience. Which of your identities and experience may impact how you approach them? So one of the things that I do when I walk into a room with someone that is a survivor is, one, I ask if I can walk into the room. So many choices have been taken away from that person. I really try to make sure that I give them as many choices back as humanly possible. And then I do things like, there are 3 chairs. Is there a place that you would prefer for me to sit? And if they don't care, then I sit wherever it is I want. But if they do, and they're like, you know what, I would really like some space, I have a seat in the chair that's farthest from them. So again, giving them options and choices. And what about the environment may impact these interactions? One of the reasons why I do encourage people to go to forensic nurse exams, whether they're reporting or not, is that a lot of times in that space, the forensic nurses themselves, and Meritor has really amazing forensic nurses. They make sure that that space, that environment is welcoming, that it is caring, that they are taken care of, that they have food, that they have drink, that they have blankets, versus I'm going to a police station where I may not have a lot of those things. It's why I always send people to forensic nurse exams first, instead of going straight to law enforcement, because law enforcement can come to that space. And then you have advocates that can come to that space. So again, when you are looking through the lens of your intersections and how it is that you interplay with persons and how it is that they interplay with you, make sure that you are considering how you show up for survivors. All right, does anybody have any questions? Yes.
Hey, is this on? Oh, I'm Kate. I'm one of the OB interns. We obviously work a lot with pregnant people, and pregnant people are at increased risk of domestic violence, sexual violence. Is there anything in particular that you would recommend in working with that population? I'm thinking in particular of a patient that came in reporting domestic assault, and she was very worried about her fetal well-being. And so we did ask questions about sort of what injuries did you sustain, so that we could elucidate a little bit further about kind of what we needed to be worried about in terms of her pregnancy status. But obviously, people who are pregnant are often forgotten as individuals and looked at as a carrier for this fetus. You know what I mean? And so
Yeah.
what would you recommend in working with pregnant people who are victims of this? And so we can both accommodate like fetal well-being while also respecting everything that you've covered in this talk.
So the first is you talk to them about what it is that they need, what it is that they're concerned about, and how it is that you can help them. So domestic violence cases are challenging because not every person is ready, willing, able, has the bandwidth to actually leave that space. So a lot of what it is that I do with my DV victims is harm reduction. And what is it that I can do to help you reduce harm? Can we do a safety plan? Are there resources that you would feel comfortable talking to that are not, that you don't have to make any big choices? Persons who are dealing with pregnancy may not want to make a lot of choices because what they're trying to do is survive. So again, pressuring people to say things like, well, you have to leave. Okay, so I'm carrying a child. This is my only means of financial support, and I might be bedridden. How exactly do you expect me to leave? Because as much as we'd like to think that there are services out in the world that just take care of it, right? Like you can just call here and you'll be good. There is a waiting list every single day for our domestic violence shelter here in Madison. Every single day there is a waiting list. So that means that persons who are in DV situations that are being harmed actually don't have a place to go. So don't assume that if you send them someplace that all of a sudden they'll be covered. So instead, talk to them about what things that they may need and what solutions you can help them work through while they're there.
Hi, thank you. Oh, for this talk, I appreciate it. I have been in scenarios where I am called after the fact and my patients have not been aware that they have been treated medically, potentially for a pregnancy that might have occurred or a sexually transmitted infection that might have occurred. And I am the one to disclose to them that they received treatment that they did not consent to outright. And that seems to be sometimes traumatic.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering just sort of your approach to that scenario, because it has happened to me multiple times.
So first, apologize that the experience that they had was non-consensual and harmful. Because any experience that you have where you don't know what's happening to you, that's harmful. Right? So, and then talk to them about what it is that they need now. And make sure that you let them know that you will be transparent with them every step of the way and explain things moving forward. But probably one of the best things that you can do is acknowledge their experience and validate their feelings. Because it's hard. You go to a place, you think that one thing is happening, and then you find out something totally different did. So please be sure to validate what their experience is, and then make sure that your behavior doesn't mimic that moving forward.
Thank you for your presentation. I had a question, and I don't know if you or like maybe other people in the audience could clarify this. I was in a scenario where a patient came directly to our triage, a pregnant patient, before being seen by law enforcement or like a forensic examiner. And so we kind of facilitated social work seeing her and law enforcement coming to see her in the hospital. And then we were informed by law enforcement that we couldn't do more like a pelvic exam to like assess for bleeding and like assess cervical dilation, because that would like invalidate any kind of exam that a forensic examiner would do. And so I'm wondering if you can provide some like clarification or like what the rules would be for that if they were to come to us first.
So you have a duty of care to your patient, not a duty of collecting evidence for law enforcement. That's not your job. So if you believe that that person needs that thing in order for that person to be safe, then you conduct your exam. Law enforcement will tell you the things that will help their case. I'm not faulting them, but they will say, here are the things that I need to move this case forward. So for example, if someone is sitting there and they're for a forensic nurse exam and they decide to not collect evidence, law enforcement is there, they'll say, well, if you don't do this, then this is what's going to happen. But if you are saying to yourself, this isn't what I want to do, that's what it is that we say to law enforcement. This is not what the patient wants. I understand that this will hinder prosecution, but that's not what it is that we're here for. We are here to make sure that that person's wishes are fully respected and moved forward. You had a question right here.
Thank you for your presentation. So sometimes when we're interacting with patients, disclosures can occur without kind of warning, to where you don't have the chance to do that protective interruption and to explain your role as a mandated reporter. Do you have any suggestions, tips for how to kind of navigate those situations, especially if the patient is requesting that you do not disclose?
Yeah, so if it's your first time seeing a patient, I actually recommend that you explain, this is who I am, this is what I do, here is my roles. Especially if you're a general practitioner and you work with children a lot. I need you to know that if you tell me something that says that you are being abused or neglected, this will be a safe space for you to tell me. Also, I will have to do certain steps moving forward, right? So that again, people are walking into a situation knowing what it is that they're having to deal with. Now, if it's the first time you walk in and they're like, this is what happened to me, you can't, I mean, you can't go back, right? But you can say, thank you for letting me know this. I need you to know that I'm a mandated reporter and this is what's going to happen next. I'm going to do the best that I can to make sure that your wishes are respected and that your rights are respected. Let's call you an advocate, because that advocate then can come there and help advocate for what it is that they need, so that you don't have to be that go-between. That advocate is there to do that for you.
Hi, I just want to put in my phone, like, okay, so if I want to say, I want to call you an advocate, I don't want that to be a lengthy thing for me to figure out or, so I don't know if I missed it, but if you could put up contact information that we could quickly take those first two steps, that'd be great.
Thank you so much. I think just to reiterate, like the logistical piece of this as residents, like the situation Rusha described, when you're seeing patients in triage or in kind of acute situations. In the past, I've just called the sane nurses here at Meritor so they can come to triage and they can help you navigate like any of those complexities that you come across. Is it correct? Am I correct in assuming then that they could also contact an advocate / could also contact law enforcement in those situations, or are those?
So don't ever contact law enforcement in a non-mandated reporting situation unless that person would like law enforcement.
Right.
So if there is a situation in triage, a lot of times Meritor nurses will talk to. Meritor nurses have even met me over at UW Hospital. I have gone to UW Hospital, which doesn't have a SANE program, and will be with that patient until they can get to Meritor. Because the first thing that happens is that they take care of medical needs first, and then they're released to go to the forensic nurse exam. So it's okay to call because the forensic nurse exam programs, and not just here at Meritor, but across the state, are very useful to tell you what it is that they can do to help you in that situation.
Great. Another kind of logistics question, specifically for teens or youths. There's a lot of people that you have to call once you get these stories from people. And would you suggest for order of who to contact, calling something like RCC first to see if the patient is interested in an advocate? And then you also mentioned like a child crisis center or something like that.
So law enforcement actually makes the referral to the forensic nurse interviewer. Yeah, the forensic interviewers at the child centers. So yes, call an advocate. And people don't understand what advocates do and are. So what I let patients know, so at Meritor, we are always called at the first time before they even get there. So somebody calls and says, I'm coming in for an F&E. We're like, great, we'll meet you there. And then the nurse and I will sit down with the patient and say, this is who I am. I can be here to help you with this, this, and this. And then that person then has the right to say, no, I don't want you to be here. More often than not, actually 99% of the time, the person's like, yeah, please stay. So if you say to someone, would you like an advocate? Most people are gonna be like, no, because I don't know what that is. I don't know what that means. Now, if you say to them, I can call someone from an advocacy center that can come here and will make sure that that your rights are being covered and that that you are getting the care that you need and can help advocate for you and maybe speak for you in situations that are uncomfortable for you. Would you like me to call that person to be here with you to go through this process? Those times they will say yes. So call an advocate if they agree to that. And then the next point would be to talk to them about a forensic nurse exam. And then the F&Es can contact law enforcement if that's what the patient wants. So you don't have to, well, if it's a child, you do have a duty. So you let them know, I do have to call law enforcement. They're going to be here. We can call an advocate to help. And a lot of times that conversation is going to happen with parents. So let the parents know what can be happening next. And sometimes you may not be able to let the parents know because the parent is the perpetrator. So in that case, get the child alone to let them know what's happening. And then you generally call CPS and law enforcement in those cases.
And then if it's something that was like they're not there immediately after and they don't need necessarily like a physical exam because there wasn't an assault, but they're youth. And so do you still think calling a forensic nurse is helpful or necessary to help getting the story and
Yep.
doing that piece of it?
So we have, so it is very typical with child disclosures that disclosure happens months after the actual incident. And we still have them come to the forensic nurse exam. Any other questions?
I just want to say thanks so much for being here. I don't actually have a question. I just do know that folks have to be somewhere at 9 o'clock, and I didn't want to cut anything off because
okay.
this is
It's
so,
okay.
so important. So let's just give you a great big round of applause.
Thank you so much, everyone.